Matt Schaff and Jared Smola of DraftSharks.com here to help you get your lineup set for week 16 of the fantasy football season. Jared, we had some news strike right before starting to record this, so we're going to react to that. And really, it hits one of the teams that deserves the most thought and consideration this week because the 49ers and the Rams squared off last Thursday night with a wholly disappointing game, whether you were watching it or just hoping for fantasy numbers from it. We had a 48.5-point Vegas line heading into that game, which was tied for second highest of the week. What we got was 18 total points. We got fewer total yards combined from San Francisco and LA than we got from either team in the Buffalo-Detroit matchup. Before we get to the changing backfield again for San Francisco, are you altering your thinking for either the Rams or the 49ers offense on whole overall heading into week 16?
No, not really. I think these things just happen in the NFL, right? And that was a short week game. Those Thursday nighters almost never go how we expect them to. There was weather in the first half of that game, and it's a divisional game, and we know those teams are just familiar with each other. That can happen. So I'm not adjusting anything based on that game. I think there are obviously concerns on the 49ers side with all their injuries. Trent Williams being a big one. He's been out for a while now. It sounds like he's probably not going to play the rest of the season. So there's some issues on that side. The Rams side, I think that offense is just fine. It's still an offense I'm going to bet on, more often than not.
Yeah, so Rams first are visiting the Jets this week, and the forecast for that game, last I saw at least, calling for 24 degrees at kickoff, which would apparently be the coldest game that Matthew Stafford's ever played in, even though he started his career in the NFC North or Central or whatever it was at that point. That kind of condition could challenge passing for the game, but the Rams also still carry an implied team total of 25.25 points, tied for 8th among week 16 teams. So it doesn't seem like Vegas is too worried about LA's chances of scoring against the Jets.
And just generally speaking, we don't worry about cold unless you're talking about into the single digits or whatever. That can impact scoring. But, something in the 24s, that generally doesn't impact scoring. It's wind we're more worried about. So we'll see about the wind as we get closer to Sunday. But like you said, Matt, the Rams have the high implied total. I will say, and we even saw this last week, the Rams are willing to go run heavy when the matchup calls for it. And they went run heavy against a 49ers defense that most teams go run heavy against. The Jets are right down there with the 49ers in pass rate over expected against. They're 27th in pass rate over expected against, which means teams tend to lean on the run against them. So I do think this should be another busy Kyren Williams game. The Rams are favored. I think, Kyren probably gets his 20 plus carries here, but we know where the ball's going in the passing game. I think, obviously starting Puka Nacua. I think Cooper Kupp is in a bounce back spot. If you survived his goose egg last week, I would have no issue going back to Kupp this week. The Niners are one of the best teams against slot receivers. The Jets have been, especially lately, one of the worst teams against slot receivers. So much better matchup for Cooper Kupp. I would have no, hesitations about going back to him in starting lineups.
Yeah, we don't have more evidence than the one rain-soaked short week game that there are issues with the Rams passing offense. So I'm going to go ahead and throw that out as well. I'm going to comfortably start the wide receivers who have been good for us much more often than they haven't. And Kyren Williams is coming off 2 straight games of 29 carries. So he should get the ball plenty again in this one. It's easy to start him this week. He might even belong higher in our rankings than he is right now, but it's a little tough to project a guy for, 27 plus carries. So we'll just start him comfortably in most places and enjoy whatever he does get. The 49ers, meanwhile, are visiting Miami, and they will do so without Isaac Guerendo in the backfield. And that became the top story this morning when Adam Schefter reported that the Niners probably won't have him because of a hamstring injury. So the question, obviously, even more than do we trust the offense, is what do we do with the backfield? Guerendo was the 3rd guy in, and last week he was playing through a foot sprain and handled every single RB opportunity in that rainy game anyway. So to me, that says San Francisco doesn't like any other running back that's on its roster really all that much.
Yeah, I mean, Patrick Taylor is nowhere near where Guerendo had been in our rankings. I think Guerendo just, a much more exciting player. Like you said, Matt, it seems like the Niners are more excited about him. Now, we did get that tiny sample in the 4th quarter of week 14 when Guerendo left with that foot injury. Over the rest of the game, Patrick Taylor had 6 carries and 1 target to Keyshawn Vaughn's 2 carries and 0 targets. So again, very, very small sample. Don't want to draw too much from that, but just the fact that Taylor's been with that team all season, he's definitely the favorite to lead the way in carries this weekend, probably even passing game work as well. I mean, Keyshawn Vaughn's bad. I mean, he was so bad in Tampa Bay. Not that Patrick Taylor is an exciting player, but I do think he's the better player. So that's the expectation. I think Taylor's in that RB3 range. I would definitely start Jerome Ford over Patrick Taylor, among these guys that you could have grabbed off waivers this week. To me, Taylor's there with Alexander Mattison, with Kendre Miller in that RB3 flex territory. Not guys you really want to use. They could get 15 plus touches if you need them.
Sorting those guys is likely to come down to who happens to get an opportunity at a touchdown, who happens to cross the goal line and actually convert that opportunity. So I agree that it's a nebulous range. And unfortunately, there are going to be some difficult decisions for us within that range that will ultimately come down to luck. The tough thing too for projection is we don't know the workload. Like I said, Isaac Guerendo headed into last week with a foot sprain in a rainy game on a short week. He missed 2 of the 3 practices leading up to that game. He still got 16 carries, 4 targets. So to me, that says the 49ers don't want to give Patrick Taylor the ball unless they have to. Now they have to. Does that mean that they give more to Keyshawn Vaughn or Izzy Abanikanda, who was on the team but inactive for last week's game? Like, do they find other ways to spread it around? Do they throw a few more carries at Deebo Samuel? We saw him get 5 carries 2 weeks ago in that game that Guerendo did leave early. He was back down to 2 carries last week, has remained inefficient with all of his touches, whether carries or receptions. So certainly not calling for the ball with the way he's playing. I think that we're probably going to get more of a passing lean than we tend to get from San Francisco. They are one of the more run favoring teams. Hard for me to imagine them favoring the run at all, really, when they have healthy Brock Purdy, Juwan Jennings, George Kittle, Deebo Samuel at whatever level he is now, Ricky Pearsall, and the backfield that we just discussed.
Yeah, we did boost the 49ers pass rate a little bit with the Guerendo news. So Brock Purdy climbed our rankings a bit. Purdy's kind of in low end quarterback 1 range. I think that's fair. It's worth noting the Niners are only implied for 21.75. So definitely lower than they usually are. I think that's on the road, traveling across country. Miami's defense has been good for the most part. There's been spots over the past month or so where they've been beaten, but it's been a pretty good defense overall. So expectations, at least, from the lines makers, are down a bit for the 49ers offense this week.
Yeah, I certainly wouldn't go reaching to use 49ers. I feel decent about Brock Purdy as a low-end QB1. George Kittle's obviously in the lineup. I would prefer not to use Deebo Samuel, although he at least, I think, gets a boost in likely usage with the backfield issues.
For sure. He had the usage last week. They were very obviously trying to get him going last week. It did not work. We'll see if they lighten that a bit. I think they should, because I think at this point, George Kittle and Juwan Jennings are this team's top 2 pass catchers. I'd feel good going back to Juwan Jennings, too. I know he disappointed along with most of that offense last week, but Jennings still saw 9 targets last week on a 29% target share. He's been north of 25% of the targets most of these games since Brandon Ayuk went down. So I think, based on volume alone, pretty tough matchup for Jennings, but I think volume should have him in fantasy lineups as a pretty nice wide receiver 2 play.
Plus, we all entered this season expecting Juwan Jennings to be the star of this 49ers offense. So it's falling in line with that. Before we got this news that Isaac Guerendo was probably going to miss the game, he was among the most searched players in our Who to Start tool, which got a significant upgrade this week. Shiny new pieces to it, including the history of who other people are searching. You'll find that down low, which might give you an idea of some other players that maybe you want to look deeper into. Maybe you weren't thinking about it, but you see other people are looking into. It's got a new strategy bar, which lets you toggle, how much you're looking for upside or how much maybe you're favoring a safer play this week, because that's going to impact who you want to pick for a certain spot. You can apply league specific scoring. So any league that you have synced, you can apply that exact scoring to your decision. It's not just, do I start this guy in PPR? It's, do I start this guy in this league? So it can only give you more precise results that way. Like I said, Who to Start got upgrades. Check it out if you've got questions, and you're even more likely to have such questions now that Guerendo is expected to miss this week. The Lions have questions after losing David Montgomery for the rest of the season, pending a 3rd and 4th medical opinion. But for now, we assume David Montgomery is out for the season, and at the very least out this week. I think, Jared, the obvious impact is more touches for Jahmyr Gibbs. They're not going to take David Montgomery's share and give it to Craig Reynolds or Sione Vaki, or even split it between those guys. So Jahmyr Gibbs looks like maybe the consensus RB1 overall for this week. Nobody was considering sitting him, so it doesn't really matter. I'm also not interested, though, in even bothering to pick up Craig Reynolds or Sione Vaki, because not only do I not expect either of them to pick up anywhere near that work, even if Jahmyr Gibbs went down this week, I'm not starting either of those guys next week against San Francisco unless I absolutely have to.
I would be higher on Reynolds, I think, than I guess you would be if Gibbs went down. So to me, Reynolds, like if you have a spot, and I know we're just talking about 1 week at this point, but if you have a spot on your bench, if something happened to Gibbs this week, I think we'd be talking about Reynolds as an RB3 play next week, just because this running game and offense in general have been so good. And as we just mentioned, I mean, not that the Niners run D is bad, but as we said with the Rams, teams tend to lean on the run against them. I would expect the Lions to do that. So again, I think Reynolds is worth stashing if you have a spot. He's not a must-own. If this was week 11 and Montgomery just went down, I think Reynolds would be a higher value handcuff just for more chance for Gibbs to go down. But it's week 16 at this point, so don't go dropping anyone of value. But I do think Reynolds could be worth stashing.
I think the less obvious impact here, similar to what we were saying with San Francisco, is probably more passing volume from the Lions. They already actually increased that area recently. They sit 23rd for the season in pass rate versus expectation, but they're up to 17th over the past 4 weeks. They passed over expectation versus the Bills last week. Not surprising because they fell behind early. So I don't know exactly how expectation works there, but they were trailing that whole game, passed plenty. Jared Goff from weeks 2 through 11, which is an 8-game span, averaged 23.4 pass attempts per game, reached 30 pass attempts once in that span. Over the past 4 weeks, though, 42.5 attempts per game, 37 per game, even if you take out that last week's spike with 59 attempts, 34 plus attempts in 4 straight games entering this one. We have Goff projected for 32 attempts this week, even versus a run funnel Chicago defense and as a 6.5-point road favorite. So even though we're all expecting the Lions to win this game and they're playing a defense that teams have run against, we like more passing volume from Jared Goff and company.
And teams been passing in Chicago too lately. That defense has been good against nothing for the last month or so. We got the 3 games without David Montgomery last year, and in those 3 games, the Lions were plus 1.7% pass rate over expected. This year, by comparison, for the year, they're negative 0.9%. So you see about 2.5% shift upward last year without Montgomery compared to what they've done this year. And even this year's mark is a bit skewed by that pass heavy game against the Bills last week. So short answer, I do think the Lions are going to pass more without David Montgomery. Obviously good news for Jared Goff. Good matchup here against Chicago. The only slight concern, and we'll see as we get closer to the weekend, is this is only Goff's second outdoor game of the entire season. The first was that game in Green Bay where the weather was horrible. I think he only threw it like 20 times in that game. He was still efficient. So yeah, that'd be the slight concern, is just Goff outdoors, potential bad weather. But we'll see as we get closer to Sunday. Everything else sets up for a strong Jared Goff game on Sunday.
Yeah, we don't tend to do too many weather adjustments earlier in the week, but as we get to the weekend and get a clearer picture of what those forecasts will be for game time, they certainly could factor into the rankings. So watch the rankings updates, watch your team intel, watch Shark Bites for specific updates on situations that require it. Obviously, that would help Jared Goff's fantasy outlook. It would help Amon-Ra St. Brown. It would make Jameson Williams, I think, a more attractive play down in wide receiver 3 range. Help Sam Laporta, maybe even some deep league possible spots for Tim Patrick, who has worked into being the clear number 3 wide receiver in recent games.
Despite no Montgomery, the Lions are still implied for over 27 points.
Moving on to another offense that has had varying questions at various points. The Jets, the past 2 weeks, have looked a lot less questionable, coming off 2 straight games of 400 plus total yards, 21 plus points in 4 straight games. I think, Jared, everybody's probably relatively comfortable with the top 2 receivers, especially Devontae Adams after the way he produced last week. But is this an offense that we should trust in general to give us fantasy points and, make its main guys our starters this week?
This offense is kind of cut and dry. Again, we know it's going to Devontae Adams, Garrett Wilson. I think Aaron Rodgers is in play again this week. For starters, it's kind of an ugly week at quarterback as far as guys to play beyond the top 10 or so. Brock Purdy's kind of the last guy to really feel good about. But after that, I think Aaron Rodgers is probably my next favorite play, probably the best streamer this week if you're looking for that, among guys that might be available on the waiver wire. I mean, the Jets have stayed pass heavy as they've been all season. Rodgers has 2 of his best 4 PFF passing grades of the season have come in these last 2 weeks, and the production has obviously followed. And then he gets this Rams defense. They're 23rd in pass defense DVOA. They're 24th in adjusted fantasy points allowed. It's quarterbacks. The Jets have a 22.25 point implied total this week. That's middle of the pack. It's 16th exactly on the week, so a decent implied total. So I'm willing to go back to Rodgers this week if you've been streaming at quarterback.
Yeah, and to your point about quarterback in general this week, we've got Anthony Richardson up at QB 10 in our primary quarterback rankings right now. Jordan Love right behind that, despite the really low passing volume recently. Brock Purdy in that range as well, coming off of a rough outing. So I agree, kind of feel good about Brock Purdy relative to the other choices we have this week, because some other guys that we've been able to trust in other recent weeks are hitting bad matchups. You can check the site and check the player write-ups for more specifics on players in their situations. Breece Hall came back last week. We didn't really expect to see him, thought the Jets would just rest him in that knee, but he did play a near even playing time split with Isaiah Davis in a game that saw Braylon Allen leave with a back injury. So that kind of adds a wrinkle of, do I start Breece Hall? As projectors and not necessarily having money on the line in a lineup that needed Breece Hall, I think you and I were hoping to not see Breece Hall last week. But what do we do now that we do have him? Let's assume for the moment that there's no Braylon Allen for this game.
Well, we've kind of seen the last 2 games Breece Hall has played, like, about what his workload's going to be, right? Like, he's going to get 12 to 15 or so opportunities. So nothing near what he usually does. Watching the games too, his like straight ahead speed is fine, but he cannot cut like he normally does, which makes sense as he's playing through the knee injury. So I don't know, he's probably 70% Breece Hall at this point, getting like 70% of the Breece Hall normal workload. So he's in like lower end running back 2 range in our rankings this week. I would play him over the Alexander Mattisons, the Kendre Millers, the Patrick Taylors. I would not grab those guys off the waiver wire and play them over Breece Hall. The matchup's good enough too. The Rams, you have not been a good run defense this season, so I think Hall will be okay. Just know you're not getting the RB1 that you drafted him as.
I'll be curious to see what we hear about what we are getting this week, though, because he's not even on the injury report this week after missing 2 practices last week, going full on Friday and then playing in the game, of course. So maybe we get more Breece Hall work in this game. I think the fact that they played him at all last week indicates that they're really not worried about that knee, and especially now that he is off the injury report. Also is worth noting, though, that this has not been a very effective run game recently. Last week's game against the Jaguars, the first time in 5 games that the Jets as a team topped 91 yards on the ground.
Yeah, and Hall's receiving usage has been down as well, really since Devontae Adams arrived. The knee hasn't helped, but the target volume has not been quite as strong since Adams arrived. So it is a good point about him not being in the injury report. I mean, I don't know exactly how that works. I think that basically means he's not being impacted in practice at all by the knee injury. Again, just watching the game last week, I could just tell he was not, the same Breece Hall we're used to seeing.
Probably has the weight of being a Jet on his shoulders too. I'm holding him down a little bit.
Tough.
Speaking of feeling the pressure, Michael Penix is about to make his first NFL start, and he is their quarterback going forward, according to Raheem Morris, which I think it makes sense for when you're making the move. You don't want to toss him in and then pull him back out again the following week. So the question is, what's the impact of Michael Penix on this Falcons offense that's been disappointing overall for a while and has some pieces that we all want to be able to depend on in our fantasy lineups? The first point, none of us really knows what Michael Penix is going to do. It's his very first start in the NFL. He has attempted 5 regular season passes in the pros so far. So we're all guessing at what game 1 is going to be. That said, I have a hard time imagining Penix, even in his first game, being worse than what Kirk Cousins has been recently, because if the coaches didn't believe that Penix was ready to, at least handle starting in the NFL, there wouldn't be any reason for them to toss him out there. It is worth noting that he is 24 and a half years old. He spent 6 years in college across 2 programs. So that's more football experience, more life experience than the typical rookie quarterback. That probably helps. He also had huge passing volume over his 2 years at Washington, led FBS in passing yards per game each of those seasons. So that's what we are getting, along with the unknown.
I think Penix brings more upside to the passing game. Maybe it's tough to even say he brings more downside because of how Cousins has played. Not only was Cousins playing poorly, but the Falcons were playing scared because of how poorly Cousins was playing. The Falcons over their last 5 games, -9% pass rate over expected, the lowest mark in the entire league. They were just scared to throw the ball. They've been leaning on Bijan Robinson. Now, I'm not sure how much that's going to change this week because you have Michael Penix making his first career start against the Giants. Right, the Falcons are currently 8.5-point favorites. I don't think Penix is going to have to do much. We did shift their pass rate up a little when we got the Penix news, but still, one of the lower projected pass rates in the league this week for us. So, I think in the passing game, Drake London's the only guy I would trust. Darnell Mooney's kind of fallen off. I do think Penix could help Mooney the most because Mooney does have the highest average target depth among these Falcons pass catchers. He's been the downfield guy, and that's what Penix does well. He has a big arm, throws a good deep ball. So maybe Mooney's upside climbs a bit with this move, but I don't feel good enough about his volume. I'd be surprised if the Falcons throw, much more than 30 times in this game. So I still think Mooney has a pretty low floor.
Yeah, I think Penix makes for an interesting cheap DFS play because of that big arm, because he's got fast receivers. Like, he very well could have a very nice game. Again, none of us knows what to expect though, so you can't really project it. But if you want to take a shot on something like that happening, that's a good place to do it. I agree with trying not to trust Darnell Mooney in my lineup. I don't think any of us wants to trust Kyle Pitts at this point. So Drake London is really the key. His ADOT is down a full yard this year versus his last year average, according to PFF's numbers. It has been up recently, though, versus the start of the season, which I thought was interesting. That change, though, has also meant a worse catch rate. 6 straight games now over 11 yards in average target depth for London. He caught 58.8% of his passes over that 6-game span. That catch rate was 70.6% over the first 8 games. So the yards per catch, like the yards per game, have been very similar over the 2 spans, but he was a much more consistent producer earlier in the season when they were throwing him shorter passes. He was giving us 6+ catches every week. It's been a bit more up and down recently. I think Michael Penix is probably going to at least not be bad for London and potentially good for his production going forward. Jared, why doesn't Drake London sit higher than low wide receiver 2 territory in our rankings right now?
Really, it's because the projected pass rate on Atlanta, right? Like, maybe we have London projected for a 27% target share. Like you have been alluding to, man, I'm not sure we should project the efficiency to really improve it with Penix. It might. I just think Penix brings more volatility to the situation in general. Like, I would not be surprised if Mooney and or Drake London like have a big game here, because maybe Penix hits them on a deep shot or two. But I also think there's probably a bit more downside as far as the efficiency goes. So London still sits wide receiver 20 or whatever. I'm sure you're starting him in most cases. I do think he remains a pretty good volume bet, even with, again, Atlanta probably not throwing it a ton in this game.
I agree with all that. He feels pretty good if you're loaded at wide receiver and you've got 3 guys or 4 guys, however many start, that are ranked higher than Drake London. They're probably in safer situations than London is this week. And let's all cross our fingers and hope that Michael Penix is at least good enough here, because there's value to be had. Jalen McMillan in Tampa Bay has been giving us value in recent weeks. Wide receiver 14 in PPR points per game over the past 2 weeks. Jared, just wide receiver 43 in our PPR rankings right now. What do you think of Jalen McMillan this week? Should we be trusting him a little bit more?
Maybe. I mean, the guy has 24 and 22% target shares over the last 2 weeks. Now, we don't have him projected that high. He's still the clear number 2 wide receiver, right? Like, Mike Evans is number 1, and we don't usually see number 2 wide receivers get mid-20s in terms of target shares. I think we have him projected for like 18%, something. I think he's an upside play, though. Like, if you've been searching for that wide receiver 4 flex play and kind of rotating throughout the season, I do think McMillan is a nice option this week again, especially for ceiling. It's just, for one, I think he's a good player, and I think he's shown that lately. Even he had some flashes early in the season, dealt with an injury mid-season, is kind of back now, but it's just a good spot. I mean, the Bucs passing game continues to be awesome. We have this spot at Dallas on Sunday night for the Bucs, so no weather concerns in that game. The Bucs have the 5th highest implied total on the week. That game has the highest over/under of the entire week at 48.5, so definitely some shootout potential there. So again, I think McMillan, not the safest bet. You can probably find safer wide receiver 4s down there, but I think in terms of upside, he's definitely a guy to consider.
Yeah, I like the target share over the past 2 games. It is just 2 games, so it's a very small sample. He certainly could dive in the other direction this week, but I love the way his quarterback has been playing this year. And I think I like McMillan up more toward the bottom of wide receiver 3 territory. The guys I'm looking at in there that I'm comparing him with: Jaden Reed, both Chiefs, Xavier Worthy and DeAndre Hopkins, Darnell Mooney that we talked about already, Rome Odunze, Debo, Jerry Jeudy. I think I feel better about Jalen McMillan this week than those guys.
I said on Tuesday's podcast I'd start McMillan over Debo Samuel, and at some point I just kind of leaning on the projections with Debo still ahead, but like I would not be at all upset with anyone starting McMillan over Debo, because Debo just hasn't been getting it done. Again, I think some of those guys you mentioned are just safer because we've seen it for longer. We kind of know their roles in the offense. It's really just been 2 weeks for McMillan now, but in terms of upside, I think he probably beats all those guys you just listed.
I agree with all that. Jerry Jeudy is the sad one in that range, because if he still had Jameis Winston, he wouldn't even be in this discussion, but he and the other Browns receivers do not have Jameis Winston this week, at least to open the game, because Cleveland is turning to Dorian Thompson-Robinson, I guess because maybe somebody is standing behind Kevin Stefanski with a blowtorch, making him think he's on a hot seat. I don't think he'll get fired after the season, regardless of how it closes out. He shouldn't, but that's the only explanation for making this kind of quarterback switch, because we've seen DTR work before. And granted, it's been a small sample, but It's not like he entered the league as a high-level prospect. In his 3 starts that we saw last year, we got completion rates of 52.8%, 55.8%, and 48.3%. Amari Cooper in those 3 games saw 20 targets and caught 7 of them. DTR has yet to top 165 passing yards in a game. He has 3.7 career yards per pass attempt. He's got 1 touchdown versus 7 interceptions. He's got a 42.6 career passer rating. Again, I say career. I know he hasn't played that much football yet, but that's part of the thing is he entered this season as the number 2. Yeah. He entered the Deshaun Watson injury game ahead of Jameis Winston. And then Winston came in after that, after DTR got hurt. And they were like, oh yeah, Jameis Winston can actually play NFL quarterback. He's going to throw interceptions. I'll be surprised if it's Dorian Thompson-Robinson starting for this team the rest of this season even, but that's the way it is this week, and I think I'm benching Browns receivers because of it.
DTR's career numbers are like impossibly bad. I have to like double take every time I look at them. Now, like we said, it's fewer than 150 attempts. It's only 3 starts, and it's worth noting too that his 3 starts last year came against the Ravens, Steelers, and Broncos. So those are 3 pretty tough pass defenses last year. He gets a better matchup this week against the Bengals, who are one of the 5 worst defenses in the NFL. I'm still not relying on DTR in any format. I'd rather not use the wide receivers. I mean, Jameis Winston, for all the interceptions he threw in his 6 full games, 315 passing yards per game, 2.0 passing touchdowns per game. We could literally get less than half of that production from DTR. So just take the numbers you've been getting from Cleveland's pass catchers and like cut them in half. As good as Jerry Jeudy's been, like that kind of leaves him as like a very fringy wide receiver 4 to me.
And by the way, Dorian Thompson-Robinson did play against the Bengals this year. That was the game where Deshaun Watson went down for the season and DTR came in first. He went 11 of 24 passing in that game, 45.8% completions, 82 yards at 3.4 per attempt, and 2 interceptions. So lots to look forward to from DTR in this game. The one guy that might be okay if he were healthy is David Njoku, who managed 6, 7, and 6 catches in DTR's 3 starts last year. And that's probably because as long as DTR is throwing the ball 2 yards downfield, he might be all right. Any further than that, it's a crapshoot.
Yeah, and at this point, I'm kind of not expecting Njoku to even play, which again, is probably better for fantasy owners because I think you're better off just looking elsewhere this week.
Agreed. Try to avoid Browns if you can, and let's all cross our fingers that DTR is so bad that Winston finishes this game and then gets back to starting in week 17. Alvin Kamara is another injury situation that we're going to be watching throughout the week to see if he's playing. He's not currently in our rankings though, Jared, and that would leave Kendre Miller as the Saints' top running back. So where are we putting Kendre Miller if Alvin Kamara doesn't play in this game?
We talked about Miller on Tuesday's waiver show. I mean, I think we feel pretty comfortable about him leading this backfield in both carries and targets if Kamara is out. The issue is just the Saints offense in this spot. On the road in Green Bay, they are 14.5-point underdogs. They have a 14-point implied total. I think that's even down from where it was on Tuesday. So just tough to get excited about any yardage or touchdown upside in this offense. I think if you play Miller, you're just kind of hoping he gets his 12 to 15 carries, maybe catches 3 or 4 passes and just kind of cobbles together a decent PPR score.
I think there's absolutely nothing to get excited about. I think if you're digging around in RB3 territory and you're like, is any of these players any good? That's Kendre Miller. He's got some talent. He's in a bad situation. He's on a team that's probably going to get blown out this week. That's likely to hurt his touch count, even if he's the lead back with Alvin Kamara out. And I mean, we'll probably see some more Jamal Williams than we did last week if there is no Kamara. And another guy in that category is Alexander Mattison, who's back in charge of the robust Raiders backfield now that Sincere McCormick has suffered his fate. RB26 in our rankings this week. Tell me about Alexander Mattison for week 16.
Yeah, so we have Mattison ahead of Kendre Miller, ahead of Patrick Taylor in our rankings, which I think I'm cool with. We've seen it from Mattison in that 4-game stretch in the middle of the season when Zamir White was out. Alexander Mattison averaged 16.5 carries and 4.0 targets per game, projecting that much this week. But I do think he's a pretty safe bet for 15 plus touches. The Raiders are actually favored in this game against the Jags for, I'm sure, one of the first times all season. The Jags rank 30th in adjusted fantasy points allowed to running backs. And then, even the Raiders have a 20.5-point implied total. Not a good number, but it's like, a full touchdown ahead of what Kendre Miller's Saints are implied for.
I project league high sadness in that game this week. Please don't watch it unless you just really are trying to torture yourself.
I could see 40 points. I could see like 53 total points in that game between two bad defenses.
It would be the saddest 46 points all year. I mean, Max Crosby's out. There's no Trevor Lawrence in this game. Both coaches are probably coaching their last few games with these teams. It's just, it's going to be a dreary picture, even if we get a decent offensive production.
Agreed.
I'm also less interested in Alexander Mattison, by the way, outside of full PPR, because the one thing that he's done relatively well is get receiving usage. So if you're relying more on his rushing stuff, I would say strongly consider other options.
Yes, don't expect rushing efficiency even in this matchup.
All right, back on the positive side. You know what? Actually, let's stay in the sad game first and talk Brenton Strange for a minute, because he's somebody that we've talked about behind the scenes a little bit whenever Evan Ingram's been hurt this year, but he kind of blasted into everyone's consciousness last week with 11 catches for about 23 yards in place of Evan Ingram. Tight end 14 in our PPR rankings this week. I think that's a fair spot for Brenton Strange. Obviously, we've seen that it's possible he gets 12 targets and catches 11 of them. I don't think we should bet on that happening again. So he's currently sitting behind Dalton Schultz and ahead of Jake Ferguson, Tucker Kraft, Cade Otton. All that makes sense to me, Jared. What about you?
Yeah, I think that's where he belongs. Same thing we said with these running backs. Like, you're not going out of your way to pick up Brenton Strange and start him, but if you're hurting at the position, I think he's a fine play this week. I mean, the Jags had the massive play volume and the massive pass volume last week in that game against the Jets, which really helped Brenton Strange. But he ran a route on 84% of the pass plays and drew a 26% target share. Those are high end marks for any tight end. We had 4 games early this season without Evan Ingram. Strange only saw 12.5% target share in those 4 games, but those came with the Jags wide receiver core healthy. Christian Kirk and Gabe Davis played in those games. So not expecting a 26% target share this week. I do think he's a good bet to see more than 12.5% target share, somewhere in between there, 15, 16, 17%, which is, again, pretty nice for a tight end. And he gets the Vegas matchup there, 29th in adjusted points allowed to tight end. So I think, Strange, not super exciting upside, but I think if you're looking for, 4 or 5 catches, I think he's a decently safe bet for that.
Yeah, you could do worse than Brenton Strange this week. Don't go out of your way to play Brenton Strange this week. Now, to close things out, let's talk quarterback, Kyler Murray, who... let's hope people have a decision on Kyler Murray this week, because that means they survived his dud last week. And I think it's important to discuss it because there are duds where a quarterback lets you down, and then there are just duds that really aren't his fault. And I think that's the case with Kyler Murray last week. Obviously, however you get there, when a quarterback scores fewer than 13 fantasy points, it's disappointing for your team, no matter what else. But he completed 76.7% of his passes in that game against New England. His team scored 30 points. That included 3 offensive touchdowns. It just so happened that those 3 offensive touchdowns came on 2 James Conner runs and then a Greg Dortch run that he fumbled to offensive tackle Jonah Williams. So Kyler Murray was on an offense that performed well. He passed efficiently. He just got left out of the touchdown picture, and sometimes that happens.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it feels uncomfortable how high Kyler Murray is in our rankings this week, but I do think it makes sense. Like you said, I do think he played fine, and he's in a really nice spot this week too against Carolina. The Cardinals have a 25.75 point implied total. That's one of the 10 highest on the week. The Panthers are 29th in adjusted points allowed to quarterbacks. The interesting thing about Arizona, I don't know why they've done this. I don't think they should be doing this, but since their bye week, they are plus 7.4% pass rate over expected. They were minus 5.1% pass rate over expected before their bye week. And it's been consistent all 4 games since their bye. They've been in positive territory in terms of PROE. So I think the offense should still revolve around the running game. That's James Conner and even Kyler Murray as part of that running game has been the best thing they've done. But for whatever reason, they've gone pass heavy lately, which can't be bad news for Kyler.
I think anytime you say I don't know why with the Cardinals, you should probably just watch a video clip of Jonathan Gannon and be like, oh, it's because their head coach is a goofball. Probably it's at least a factor in it, I guess. So Kyler Murray is QB 8 in our ranks for week 16. I think it's fair to have him up there. If I'm making a decision between him and Jaden Daniels, I think I might have to go Kyler Murray this week. I can understand saying, nah, Jaden Daniels has been too good for me. I'm going to sink or swim with him. That's totally fine. Murray's matchup is way better, though. Jaden Daniels had the second lowest fantasy score he's had all season in his healthy games in that first meeting with Philly. And Philly enters this one as the 4th toughest QB matchup by adjusted fantasy points allowed.
Yeah, it wouldn't be crazy to start Murray over Daniels. The one thing I'll say is that Jaden Daniels rushing has come back. There was like a 3-4 game stretch where he was playing through the rib injury where he wasn't really running. Kyler Murray, by the way, is not really running. He really hasn't all season, and especially lately. And I think since the bye week, his rushing numbers have been way down. So that's the main reason that Jaden Daniels sits ahead of Kyler in our rankings this week is just the rushing projections.
Yeah, probably a higher floor for Jaden Daniels, probably a higher ceiling for Kyler Murray. Tough decision. They both could be good. They both could disappoint this week. That's the I don't want to say it's the fun part. That's the tough part of playing this game. And if you make the right decision, you feel like a genius. And if it doesn't work out your way, then you have to sit on it all through the offseason.
And listen, if you're making that decision at quarterback this week between 2 top 8 guys in our rankings, there's a good chance that you're doing okay at the position.
Yeah, there's not a wrong choice between them, even if it ends up going wrong for your team. So if you end up with the wrong guy in your lineup, try not to beat yourself up for it. Head to your team intel page for all of your sync teams to try to make the right choice for all of those lineup decisions. And like I said earlier, check out our upgraded Who to Start tool. Got brand new features in there. It's got player history on those searches. So check it out, play around with it, see what you think. Let us know what you think. We like to get feedback on the stuff we put on the site because we want everything on draftsharks.com to make it your unfair advantage.